Ooh, that I love this question because I've been thinking a lot about writing. I've had a tumultuous relationship with writing throughout my life. In elementary school, I was told by teachers, "Oh, you're a good writer," and then by middle school, high school, my teachers were like, "You're a terrible writer."
Hmm.
Um, and
Wow.
then it was like I entered a profession that requires writing, right?
Hmm.
Eventually, but it's it I think it goes back to becoming a mom, that identity shift. I want to say traumatizing shift in some way
Yeah.
for me, um, was it just made me return to myself, right? I became a mom also about 2 years after my own mother had passed. And
Wow.
so it was all of these things, these layers that were just emotionally tumultuous for me
Hmm.
and roiling. Um, And so part of it was just a lot of reflection about what does it mean to be who I am today.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Mamta Akapati. Student Affairs Now is a premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. This episode is sponsored by Huron, a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice. Today's episode is also sponsored by Routledge, Taylor, and Francis. View their complete catalog of authoritative education titles at routledge.com/education. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast for more episode about each of our sponsors. As I shared earlier, my name is Mamta Akapati. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am broadcasting to you today from Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas is situated on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Humanos, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Lipan Apache, and Tonkawa peoples. My friends, you're in for a true treat today. I have butterflies. I'm super excited about this conversation. I am
Me too.
so I'm so excited to welcome not only a thoughtful and brilliant scholar and educator, but someone who I have considered a long time as a mentor. Dr. Oiyan Poon is a co-director of the College Admissions Futures Collaborative and a senior research fellow focusing on education equity at the NAACP LDF Thurgood Marshall Institute. Her research agenda brings together organizational theories and race and ethnic studies to study rejective admission and selection processes, the racial politics of Asian Americans in education, and affirmative action policies. Her work has appeared widely in the national media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the New Yorker. So friends, please welcome my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Oiyan Poon. Oiyan, thank you
Thank you,
so
Malta.
much. It's just such a, I mean, I feel like this is a reunion. It's kind of a fan club moment here for me. So I'm
We
just,
grew up together.
I
We
know,
grew
yeah.
up together.
Yes, I definitely, as a kindred spirit, and beyond that, I mean, you're always somebody that I've tried to aspire to live and lead like, and so to be in this space with you just feels so restorative for me, and I love that I can share that in a public forum like this, and I'm so
I feel
grateful.
so similarly about you.
It's thank you, and
It's a
it's
love fest. It's a
yeah,
love fest.
it is this y'all. This is going to be a love fest for sure. So welcome to the podcast. Um,
Thank you.
so, you and I could probably talk for hours on a lot of things, and let's be candid. We're here to talk very specifically. We're gonna have to contain our energy and time. Um, but I'm super excited. I mean, to hear about your book. I just want to celebrate your book. Oh, yay! Okay, yes, okay, folks can see it. Okay, that's good.
Oh gosh,
Um,
it's blurry. There
yeah,
it is.
there you
There
go.
it is.
So I'm so excited to hear about your book. Thank you for the opportunity to read it. I really enjoyed it, and we'll talk more about it. But your book, Asian American is Not a Color: Conversations of Race, Affirmative Action, and Family. Um, and I'm excited to get into the book. And you do such a great job. There's so much, it's not just knowledge, there's ancestral wisdom woven throughout your book. And so before we kind of go into that, I would love for our listeners to hear more of your wisdom through just, I mean, we'd love to hear pieces of your journey. Like, what has your journey been like in higher education so far? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Mamta, you and I go way back. And so the start
We
of my
do.
career in higher education was probably around the same time as your start as well. So we grew up together in the profession, and I don't take that lightly. I value and treasure
Hmm.
that we have journeyed alongside each other. Um, and I've learned so much from you throughout the years. I can remember in pinpoint moments where I was just like, I really want to talk to Mamta about this. Um, from across the country, right? Because
Yeah.
we've never actually lived in the same place
No.
or worked together
Mhm.
directly. But yeah, my journey is probably probably rather typical of student affairs professionals. Um, I had a bumpy but rewarding college experience. I was an RA, of course, and so then I have the hall director experience in the mix. I did the student affairs master's program stint, and really pursued multicultural affairs.
Yeah.
And at a time, this is like the late 90s, early 2000s, right around the time when I think Asian American student services and student experiences were coming more into the conversation.
Yep.
Um, uh, Either through students pushing those issues very actively and pushing for institutional accountability, or otherwise, right? And so I, as a master's student at the University of Georgia, was very much part of that kind of activist tradition, and was always like, why aren't Asian Americans more in the mix when it comes to, at that time, multicultural affairs,
Yeah.
right?
So
And they call
how
that
many, I mean,
DEI.
just, you're right. We did grow up in the profession. And so as you're telling the story, this is what folks have a context. So how many other Asian Americans were alongside you as you were doing this work at that time?
Um, Not many, because
Yeah.
I was the first Asian American student affairs person
Yes.
at two different major
Yeah.
universities, right?
Yes.
Um, so my first job was in a multicultural affairs office, as it was called, like
Yes.
20-ish plus years ago.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I was the very first one uh, assigned,
Yep.
the task of addressing Asian American and Pacific Islander student needs and issues and interests. And then I was recruited to University of California, Davis,
Hmm.
where I was the first student affairs officer in Asian American Studies, right? So,
Right. Right.
um, yeah, so literally my student affairs profession started in that time of like these positions popping up. I think there was someone at UVA,
Yeah.
and that person was the first. There was
Yep.
someone at Dartmouth, that
Yep.
person was the first.
Yes.
There was UConn,
Yeah.
Angela. How can I forget, right? And Angela was like a pioneer,
Hmm.
uh, right? And but there was just, I mean,
Yep.
we knew everyone back in the day of email listservs,
Yep.
right? And email chains.
Mm.
So that's how I got my start in the profession. And it was during my time at UC Davis. And that job was really interesting because it's California.
Yeah.
I'm an East Coast girl, right? And all of us east of California, we're like, oh man, California's got it so good, right? But
Uh-huh.
there was a string of attacks at UC Davis, violent incidents targeting Asian American students at UC Davis, which was at the time 35% Asian American students,
Wow.
right? And so that critical mass was there, sure,
Yeah.
but that doesn't, diminish the reality of anti-Asian racism or
Absolutely.
violence,
Yeah.
right? And so this is in the late 90s, I think,
Yep.
and the students got together. But what was important was they got together um, in a cross-racial coalition.
Yep.
And they said, you know what? Yes, we need to fix the campus climate. And they did it intergenerationally. So they
Mm.
worked. pre-social media,
Mhm.
pre-texting, right?
Yes.
Conference call lines and all,
Yes. Phone
right?
trees.
Um,
Phone trees.
phone trees, all of that, that kind of organizing. Um, and they won a whole lot of games at UC Davis post Proposition 209, mind you,
Hmm.
right? Sure, it was like decades of movement, but the wins they got, a student affairs officer in Asian American studies, that became, I was the first one in that job, a Native American studies student affairs officer, right? The expansion of a permanent cross-cultural center, that building exists now.
Yeah.
These were all gains that finally got won after the quote unquote end of affirmative action in California.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just taking a moment to think about that because we're in a particular moment
Right now.
post Supreme Court
Yes.
ruling, right? Um, and so it was in that job that was won by community activism
Hmm.
and campaigns where I started thinking a lot about systemic problems. I was academic advising, I was doing admissions reading, I was working with students on retention issues and realizing, wow, there's systems at play, and I really want to be part of fixing those systems because it's not just how do I help this one student and that one student,
Yeah.
um, but how do I fix this larger system?
Yeah. And so,
Yeah.
so from there, you shifted to, well, you've always been a scholar and shifted kind of to an academic journey to be able
Hmm.
to kind of contribute to shifting systems. Any reflections you
Yeah.
have on that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I was one of those on the ground people meeting students on day in
Hmm.
and day out, students who were being pushed out, dealing with all these kind of situations that could be systemically solved. And I would go to my leadership
Yeah.
in the division,
Yeah.
and I'd be like, hey, vice chancellors, here's
Yes.
what I think needs to happen. And repeatedly, I would get the retort, where's the data? What's the
Yeah.
evidence? How do you know this is not just the handful of students? And I'm like, handful, my butt, it's like 500
Hmm.
students.
Yeah.
Like it feels like every day, right? And so you can call it anecdotal,
Yes.
right? But it's still evidence. And the leadership would say, like, that's great. I'm still making big budget decisions. I'm gonna need stronger data.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, where am I supposed to get data? I'm not the IR office,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I tried to work with the IR office and there was a little more data there, but it was like something's not connecting. And so then because I was in an academic department in Asian American Studies, um, I I was reporting to them and the vice chancellor of student affairs. I would tell these faculty, oh, I'm supposed to go find data. Where am I? How am I supposed? Finally, one of the professors was like, "Why don't you go get the data? Why don't you go learn to get the data?" And I'm like, "What do you mean learn to get the data?" And they're like, "Go get a PhD." And I was like, I wasn't talking about getting a PhD. And they're like, that's what a PhD is for. You get a
Hmm.
PhD so you learn how to get evidence and work evidence and do analysis and analysis that can then inform changes and motivate
Yeah.
change. And I was like, oh, this is first generation student
Yeah.
me,
Say,
right? I
yeah.
was like, oh, is that what a PhD is?
Yes.
Thanks for telling me.
Amazing.
So that was the pivot,
That was
right?
the
I was like,
pivot.
I guess I'll go learn how to do data.
That's amazing. Again, I'm sure we could have an entire topic just on that very conversation and even, navigating those journeys as first gen kids for sure. Um, I and you and I had a chance to kind of process before we started recording. I just your book is so powerful for many reasons as we kind of engage in our conversation. And I just, it's clear that there is so much of your humanity woven through so in addition to the data, in addition to your intellect is your humanity and your ancestral wisdom. I always like to reference that phrase in this book, and so it's so inspiring for me to read. There's a a question that you ask in the beginning of your book. It's something that I think you were grappling with. How do you teach a kindergartner about the histories and contemporary legacies of race and racism in a way that affirms her humanity and agency? And her referencing your daughter. Um, and I just, I love that of the identities that you bring. I mean, your motherhood is so salient
Hmm.
in this book. But truly, like, how did your identities and experiences inform and inspire the book and your writing process?
Yeah. This book has been a labor of love in a way that has I've never written anything like this before. I went and did a PhD, right? I learned how to do research and research writing, academic writing. I got very good at that. It's very formulaic. Journal articles have a very particular, here are the 5 or 6 sections that you're supposed to write. And it was just, you learn how to do that. Um, and like I joke, like, oh, and then 10 people read that article that you worked on for 2 years. Um, So yeah, first and foremost, I think my experiences and my identity as a mom, is what's really driving at the heart of this book project. Because right around the time, when my daughter was starting to become verbal,
Yeah.
she was about 3 years old. And she started asking me all these questions about the world and about race and you know, and I know she's not unique in asking those questions because this is just human development, right? We know
Yeah.
also from
Hmm.
research that babies
Hmm.
and toddlers start recognizing differences in the world and they start having questions. And so it boggles my mind to see these quote unquote parents' rights
Hmm.
campaigns, these book
Hmm.
banning
Hmm.
campaigns. I'm so confused. I'm just so confused. I
Yeah.
mean, we're here in Texas right now,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Hmm.
one of the places where these no teachers should not be teaching
Yeah.
about, you know, any kind of diverse identities, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and histories, I'm just so confused by that because I am a whole race scholar, right?
Yeah.
Like I study race and education all day long, and then when my daughter started asking me questions about race and racism at 3 years old, I didn't know how to answer her, right? She asked me like, "Are we black? Are we white?" And I was like, "No, we're Asian American." And she was like, "Yeah, that's not a color." And so that's where the title of the book comes
Oh,
from.
yeah.
Yeah, Mom, Asian American's not a color. And I'm like, "You are correct, and I need to tell you so much more." Um and of course she was 3, so I things like, well, Omi and Winant would say through the
Yeah.
theory of racial formation that
Yes.
you're not wrong, dear child. However, right, these political projects that make meaning of, you know, phenotype and there are political realities and power at play that doesn't work for a 3-year-old, apparently, or probably most people generally, right? Um, and so I think that question was like, my God, I have a whole
Mhm.
degrees and publications on, analyzing race and racism in education. And I don't even know how to talk to my daughter
Wow.
about these things. So then if I can't talk to my daughter, then how do I talk to regular people in my community,
Yeah.
right? Who could maybe benefit from understanding race and racism at a deeper level. And maybe then we wouldn't be where we're at, where people are feeling all kind of fragility
Yeah. Yeah.
and feelings of insecurity when their kid asks these questions.
Right.
One of the questions in the book I open one of the chapters with, uh, you may remember, is when my daughter came home last year and asked, "Are we colonizers?" Right? And I joke sometimes, I'm like, and then I was like, "Where's my local Moms for Liberty chapter?"
Yeah.
Right? But obviously I didn't do it, but it did make me think
Hmm.
about, okay, that question did make me uncomfortable,
Yeah.
right? And
Hmm.
but let me contend with my discomfort. And I have the language, I have the training
Hmm.
to work through that and talk with her about it.
Hmm.
Um, but is that why some of these other mostly white parents are freaking out? Are their kids coming home with these kind of questions? And are they reacting in ways that are dangerous and terrible,
Yeah. Yeah.
but how do we disrupt that? How do we
Yeah.
say, like, yeah, I hear you. You feel
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
It's
Let's
interesting.
lean into that discomfort.
Again, I shared this with you before, and kind of as we kind of move in to the next reflection question I have for you. Um, there a parallel question. My daughter and I've been talking a lot about privilege, and so the uncomfortable, right, particularly for her, as and certainly had privilege when I was younger too, in ways that I may not have realized, but she very clearly has very different dimensions of privilege. And so her grappling with, okay, I have privilege? I know I have privilege, and for it to be okay to be in the discomfort around those privileged identities, and then how
Mhm.
you show up in those ways, as opposed to like really I feel like there's an opportunity to disrupt the entry of guilt and shame at an early point, to say,
Yes.
okay, how do we pay attention, acknowledge, and what do subtle disruptions look like? Because with subtle disruptions you pave the way for bigger conversations and more meaningful
Right.
relationships. And so I just feel like, again, your book just is that invitation, to be able to, with appropriate and uh, information. So the find the
Successful.
data
I'm
is
hoping
also
to.
there, right?
Yeah.
It's interconnected, in such
Right.
a meaningful and powerful way. I mean,
This book was really
yeah.
my challenge to myself to be like,
Oh,
okay, maybe I don't know. I don't need to try to explain this to a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 9-year-old, which she is turning 9 next month. But what I need to do is challenge myself to write
hmm.
and offer the stories from my research in a way that is accessible to intelligent, educated
Yeah,
people who may not be immersed
right.
in race theory.
Yeah,
Because you
absolutely.
don't have to be,
Right,
right?
exactly. Um, I still, I would still like to reflect a little bit more about your writing journey, if you know, in as much as you're willing to share. I personally felt so validated as a human being as I was reading, as a person with all of my own identities as I was reading this book. It was part history lesson, part love letter, part memoir, and so much more. I feel like I'm not those separate pieces don't even capture kind of the interplay of those different observations. And then a piece of me felt like I don't mean to co-opt, but I felt like I was reading a version of my own story and race consciousness and motherhood. And so the way that you created opportunities for a reader to relate in, and claim their stories by you claiming your own voice, was just really powerful. And I wonder, what did that writing process feel like? What was your experience in the actual writing journey?
Ooh, that I love this question because I've been thinking a lot about writing. I've had a tumultuous relationship with writing throughout my life. In elementary school, I was told by teachers, "Oh, you're a good writer," and then by middle school, high school, my teachers were like, "You're a terrible writer."
Hmm.
Um, and
Wow.
then it was like I entered a profession that requires writing, right?
Hmm.
Eventually, but it's it I think it goes back to becoming a mom, that identity shift. I want to say traumatizing shift in some way
Yeah. Uh-huh.
for me, um, was it just made me return to myself,
Yeah.
right? I became a mom also about 2 years after my own mother had passed. And
Wow.
so it was all of these things, these layers that were just emotionally tumultuous for me
Hmm.
and roiling. Um, And so part of it was just a lot of reflection about what does it mean to be who I am today.
Hmm.
And I think I shared with you earlier before we started recording, I was like, it made me realize I'm like, oh, I'm an Asian mom.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm an Asian mom, right? And there's all these like jokes and stereotypes about who Asian moms are and what we're, the demandingness, right? All these stereotypes and jokes that are out there about Asian moms. And I was like, oh shoot, I am now an Asian mom. And I'm not, and it made me think of, and I was thinking a lot about my own mother,
Hmm.
right? And I wasn't able to ask her things while
Yeah.
she was alive as a mom to a mom.
Yes.
But I started seeing and thinking about my own mother in a different way,
Uh-huh.
which then made me think about Asian moms
Yes.
differently in a new way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there's this really
and so,
powerful, I would say there's a really powerful, as you bring that up, a moment where you talk about your daughter, where you wake up and she says something like, I was talking to your mom.
yeah, she was 2 when she
Yeah,
said that to me. Freaked me out.
that
It's
was amazing.
the icy ghost chapter is what I call it,
Uh-huh.
and about the historical legacies of our
Yes.
ancestors.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so it was like all of these things. And around the time I had my daughter, I had just finished up these interviews. I was finishing up these interviews across the country with Asian Americans who
Hmm.
were activists in the affirmative action debate, either for or against. And the stories that these people shared with me, I really wanted to share it in a book. And I kept trying to write in an academic way, and it just wasn't coming out.
Hmm.
It wasn't until my daughter was 3 and asked me, "Are we black? Are we white?" That I was like, I can't answer it succinctly, but let me write this book for you and draw from these other stories. And that's when things started just really flowing,
Yeah.
right? Where
Mhm.
I was like, okay, I need to explain to you a little bit about our history.
Yeah.
I want you to learn about history of who we've been and the choices that we've made, right? So I think also the book was really inspired by Grace Lee Boggs'
Yeah.
quote where she says, you don't choose the times you live in, but you choose how you act and how you think. And I think that's what my daughter was asking me when she was asking, what is
Hmm.
it essentially, what does it mean to be Asian American? Right.
Yes.
And I'm trying to tell her in this book um, that she has choices, but you need to learn from our histories and contemplate the various possibilities that have already been set out before us.
Yeah.
But you can also carve out a completely new path, but you have to do that in relationship and solidarity with other people as well.
Yeah.
Um,
So thoughtful.
and so this is where it was like once I tapped into my heart space,
Hmm.
it was like, oh, now this thing is coming through now. And I couldn't write it until I literally wrote down Dear Tay Tay. Like,
Oh,
and
that's
that's when it was like, okay, I'm writing to my daughter, and I would love it if other people would
hmm
join in and read along,
hmm
and be a voyeur if you like.
hmm
Um, but I have one audience in mind, and it's my daughter.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. I mean, again, just and you could feel the intimacy in the book, right? So there's an invitation and there's an intimacy. I actually don't feel in a voyeur. I mean, I feel like there's an invitation where you give us permission to be part of your story, and I really thank you for letting us in that sacred space. That just it means so much. In our conversation, you mentioned your research. And so throughout your research process, as you did kind of listen to the stories of the 36 Asian American activists, you referenced half being supporters of race conscious admissions and the other half opponents. That kind of course, intertwined with your own personal narrative. There's a space in your book where you say you were kind of really trying to seek the answer to the question, what does it mean to be Asian American? Um, what surprised you the most about that research journey alongside your research participants?
So first, I have to give credit where credit is due to Professor Peter Kiang at UMass Boston, because I never had the idea to invite anti-affirmative action folks
Wow.
to be in conversation. I never thought about that. I had always, and I think if you look at the research literature
Hmm.
on Asian Americans who are opposed or like the different perspectives on the issue among Asian Americans, there's very few works where people have actually talked to people,
Yeah.
right? It's all theoretical, and I'd done that, right? I had theorized, well, I'm seeing these news articles about these people, I'm seeing these social media postings by these people. Um, and then I think it was at a conference where Professor Peter King and I were in a group of other, I think it might have been AERA. So it was an ed research conference, and people were at a cafe, and I was really upset about, I think it was 2013 or 14 when there was this anti-affirmative action campaign in California, because there was efforts to reinstate affirmative action.
Hmm.
And I was just just venting about what are these people thinking? You're Asian American. and there's anti-Asian discrimination, and you want to, you want to stop
Mm.
these laws that are meant to help you. Like,
Yeah.
what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
Right? And Peter just very quietly, and if you've ever met Peter, he's just very like low key, chill. He goes, "Have you ever talked to these people?"
Yeah.
I was like, "Why would I ever do that?"
Yeah.
And he was like, "I don't know, maybe you'll learn something." So I just wanted to preface, engaging with your question by talking about that, because I think your question being alongside the
Hmm.
research participants is so important, because I actually really enjoyed my time for the most part
Hmm.
in listening and just listening and inviting folks into community, because these are people who are in my community,
Hmm.
right? Who share an identity with me,
Hmm.
for better or worse, right?
Hmm.
And we have ideological differences, but what I learned was even the folks I shared ideologies with, they didn't understand what affirmative action was, and that
Right.
that really got under me, right? I was just like, oh my gosh, how is it that you're the advocates and you're spreading
Yes.
misinformation? Oh
Hmm.
my gosh, you're my people. We are political
Hmm.
kin, right?
Hmm.
And you're getting it wrong. How is this possible? And then what really kind of across the board, everyone I talked to, at the end of the day, it was about love. Like, we
Yeah.
still share a love for, our communities, our families, and we all had our struggles, like different struggles in the face of anti-Asian racism and discrimination and violences. Like, we all had those
Yeah.
shared experiences. It was just that we had different strategies for dealing with these
Hmm.
problems.
Yeah.
And I have deep disagreements. We have deep disagreements with each other, but it just reminded me, like, one of the most adamant anti-affirmative action people I interviewed, there was this one point in the interview where and it was on Zoom, and his daughter, who was about 8 or 9 at the time, ran into the room, and he just had this very sweet moment
Mm.
with his daughter, and he put it on mute. But I was just like, this is a dad.
Yeah.
He and I disagree deeply with each other, and there are things that are coming out of his mouth that I find deeply offensive. And at the same time, there's still this basic humanity that he loves his daughter.
Hmm.
He loves his daughter. I love my daughter. How do we get across this divide where at the end of the day, the things that are going to come out of his mouth publicly are going to also reflect on me,
Hmm.
and vice versa?
Hmm.
Do we have to share
Hmm.
political ideology?
Yeah.
I, I don't know. This is my struggle,
Yeah.
right? Like, I don't think we need to.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. You talk about, again, the parenthood uh, reflections are real throughout the book, and this example reflects that. Um, and ancestry, certainly links as parents, but it's beyond that, right? It's beyond that, generationally speaking. And so, one point in your book, you ask the question, how do we become good ancestors? Um, and I would love to know what that means to you.
Yeah, and I have to give credit to Native and Indigenous scholars and mentors of mine who, and writers and leaders who've talk a lot about,
Yeah.
how do you create a present now, a contemporary reality right now? How do you act in this moment so that you open up possibilities in the future
Hmm.
that aren't possible right now?
Hmm.
Um, and for me, it is about doing things that I feel like will affirm, you know, be affirming of humanity,
Yeah.
right? Of human experiences, and being open to it and lifting up people. Um, and it's a choice of solidarity,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so I think that's what it means for me, is that I'm not staying neutral in the book, right?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, absolutely.
I do say to Tay, right, that like you have choices, and right now there's these people who all identify as Asian American, just like you and I do, and
Hmm.
they're making different political investments for a future.
Hmm.
Um, and so for me to be a good ancestor, what is my vision? It is a multiracial, shared community, society, when we work together and we figure out problems together to fix them, right? So that we don't, I was just talking to someone about we don't have the machines taking over.
Yeah.
Um, but, yeah, it's how do we affirm and support and lift up people in their experiences and their wholeness? Um, because I think in a lot of ways, our world is going in that opposite direction.
Yeah.
And that was set up already, right? Like people created what we have today, all these machines and
Yeah.
the things in the world, right? So how do we make it so that that there, they always says like, can we just end wars? Like this is
Yeah.
stupid. Just
Yeah.
end them. End them because clearly you adults have really messed up the earth. Can we stop this climate change thing? Because I would like to be able to live to an old age and breathe clean air and drink clean water.
Yeah.
Um, just so many things, right? If we know, I mean, climate change is a perfect example.
Hmm.
We know we're on this path. Why are we not?
Yeah. Making different
Why
choices.
are we not
Yeah.
making different choices? And that applies to higher ed too,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Internally, it's not just this like throw your hands up and like we can't do anything about our worlds, but as higher ed professionals and leaders, we have um, we have our own little corners and our spheres of influence,
Hmm.
right? And that can add up.
Yeah.
It can build movements, right?
Yeah. I think I just, the invitation for an interconnectedness, right? Interconnectedness is hard, and it's part of our shared work. And so I think that hope came across very strongly, and I know that I was grateful to receive it for sure. Among many things, and you've already kind of begun talking about some of these complexities, but one of the things I really appreciate about your book is that you managed to convey such complex and nuanced issues in a really accessible and grounded way. I still have it, you and I talk about this all the time. I still have a lot of like, I don't feel like I fit in academic spaces. I don't, use the big words. I don't feel smart enough. And I just loved how accessible your book was, and clearly rigorous, rigorous in research, and accessible for a common reader. And it just, that, so I just want to offer gratitude. That means a lot to me. And there are some, like I have like my favorite kind of quotes that I've kind of picked out. And this idea of you share a realization, and I just want to I'll read the quote. I realize that Asian Americans are engaged in heated identity wrestling matches. We wrestle to make our identities and perspectives exist in this world and be recognized. Um, and I think this was in, the section or chapter where we're talking about, various the litigious Asian Americans that, in that particular section. But this idea of acknowledging our existence and kind of the ways in which we grapple in order to claim that was just really, really powerful. Um, and then kind of parlaying that into another quote, um, you talk about this idea of you have the two fallacies that you bring up, right? And so um, I'll quote just to give accuracy to the reflection, but the claims that race conscious admissions policies are anti-Asian rely on racially biased logics, racial anxieties, and two fallacies. So kind of with that wrestling that you talked about before, um, you bring up these two fallacies. The first being that all Asian Americans pursuing college degrees are extraordinarily talented. above and beyond other Americans. And then the second, that all Asian Americans wish to attend highly selective colleges and universities. So both of those things, because the interplay of wrestling with this idea of where we exist and how to be visible and these two fallacies, like the interplay of these two things really pique my curiosity.
Mhm.
So as I'm processing these things, what would you want people to know about the complicated way in which Asian Americans are situated in race conversations, specifically related to race conscious admissions and affirmative action?
Yeah. Um, I think when it comes to Asian Americans, there's kind of a paradox happening between or a tension or a dialectic, whatever you want to call it. But there's these kind of situations where we're trying to figure out who we are,
Yeah.
number one, right? So that's the identity wrestling that I borrowed that term from Professor Carol Lee.
Mhm.
Um, and she talked about identity wrestling as a civic engagement, right? So I think as a community, Asian Americans generally are still trying to figure out who are we, right? Um, but we do know some things to be true. We remain a community that experiences racial marginalizations and violences,
Yeah.
right? And um, so that is something that we collectively recognize in general, if I may use generalizations. And at the same time, there's mainstream discourses that are trying to make sense of who we are, right?
Hmm.
So mainstream discourses that appear in things like CNN, New York Times, right? The mainstream media,
Hmm.
right? Um, that then purport to know who we are,
Hmm.
um, without evidence, right? So an example, oftentimes I'll ask like, uh, who sued Harvard? Who sued Harvard? Right? And oftentimes off the bat, people are like, oh, Asians sued Harvard. That is not true. That
Hmm.
is false. That is plain and simple false. It was this white man named Ed Bloom,
Hmm.
right? But he did mm, a repugnantly frustrating campaign to bamboozle a lot of mainstream media and public conversations to make people think, oh, Asians are suing. And he was leaning into stereotypes of hardworking, high achieving, deserving Asian Americans in contrast to undeserving, stereotypes of Black students and Latinx students and Native students, right? So this pitting against each other of communities of color. And at the end of the day, when you actually learn our histories and where actually even the term Asian American comes from, it
Yes.
comes from racial solidarity and the civil
Yeah.
rights movement.
Hmm.
And so it's it's been really frustrating to see this. And so I think this is what partly that identity wrestling is about. We're trying to figure out who we are. And at the same time, the mainstream dominant discourse is already telling us who we are
Hmm.
based on falsehood,
Yeah.
based on racial stereotypes of us and other people of color.
Well, and a false appropriating of, oh, this is racist, right?
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is, and poor Asian Americans, this is creating a
poor Asians,
discriminatory for
poor Asians.
for the poor Asian American population. So then as we're trying to figure out who we are in society, we're trying, like, there is this, you know, I mean, fear is a powerful thing, fear and a sense of belonging. Those are very, very
Hmm.
powerful emotions. Um, uh, so yeah, that's really, really compelling to hear you reflect on that.
Yeah, and I think one other thing about the complicated way, right?
Hmm.
That Asian Americans are situated in race conversations, especially in higher education,
Yeah.
because so many of the conversations about race rely on notions of representation,
Yeah.
right? I think it's very important, don't get me wrong, it's very important to use that framework of representation, underrepresentation,
Yes.
especially as a way to understand one symptom, a major symptom
Yes.
of the problems of systemic racism. But that doesn't mean, right, that if you hit, oh, look, there's parity now, that doesn't mean racism is over,
Yeah.
right? If that was the case, and oftentimes people will say to me, well, Asians seem overrepresented, quote unquote,
Mm.
um, in some of the most elitist institutions of higher education. And
Hmm.
I'm like, yeah, racism is still around. Have we not seen
Yeah.
the uptick in
Yeah.
anti-Asian violence in the last few years? If representation was the key to solving things like racism, does that mean like racism's over? Like anti-Asian racism is not a thing anymore?
Mm.
Right? No, it's that's just not. That's such a narrow
Yeah.
understanding. And then, this goes back to my time as a student affairs professional was there were just I could draw from so many stories of Asian
Mhm.
American students
Yeah.
and okay, great, they're in a University of California campus, but let me tell you all the ways that they've been made to feel they don't belong, or that, you know, just the various forms of psychological, mental, emotional violences that they've had to go through. And this is not an oppression Olympics that I'm calling for, but I'm saying
No.
that we need to see the totality of outcomes of systemic racism.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you invite and challenge us to think, certainly as you kind of reflecting back what I heard you say, reflection is one, representation is one component for sure. Um, Certainly not a singular, right? The singular
Right.
factor. Um, you challenge us to think about the condition of people and the historical and current contexts that inform those conditions, which continue um,
Right.
over time. I mean, I think again, as I said, your book is part history lesson, and uh, even though I have read and studied the history, I don't know what it was when I was reading it, over the past couple of weeks. I'm like, I know this. And I was lucky to, I mean, I didn't experience or learn Asian American history until as a doctoral student was kind of when I was exposed of
Mm-hmm.
the Japanese American internment. So, but it was interesting as I was rereading, you know, just your the chronology of court cases. I'm like, this is all happening again. It's almost
It
exactly
is.
the same, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so um, in a weird way, I was having a physiological response to that, like, oh my gosh. And then in another way, when you then point out, and these are the ways that people addressed, or and this is, like you showed um glimmers of hope and opportunity through those moments and how solidarity movements and activism rose, through those particular experiences. So I just
That's the only way
yeah.
we win is
Yeah.
solidarity,
Yeah.
right? And you mentioned how do we raise our daughters who
Mhm.
have immense privileges, right? It's not
Yeah.
through guilt or shame to understand their privileges. I think if anything, what my daughter has taught me is just like, yeah, I have privileges, but so should everyone else,
Yes.
right? Like this shouldn't be a special condition. My safety, my comfort, my full belly, my house, the
Mhm.
fact that I don't have to ask for things like that. I
Yes.
live a very comfortable life. This should be for everybody,
Yeah.
right? And so she's actually been trying to she's been trying to convince her friends in the third grade to write a letter writing campaign to Congress and our city officials around, um, housing should be free. She's like, doesn't make sense. Why is housing so expensive?
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
and so, yeah, she's like, rather than, there's all these zero sum conversations out there. They're like, well, are you
Mhm.
going to give up your privileges? And I'm like, yeah, if it means everyone else has the same level of
Yeah.
circumstances, let's do it. Like,
Yeah.
let's have everyone having safe
Yes.
homes and neighborhoods and well-resourced you're like, yeah,
Yeah.
let's do it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's what we're fighting for, not
Yeah.
for people to get less, but everyone to
Yeah. Yeah. And it,
have a baseline.
it's such a shift, right? I mean, I hate not my intention is not to use cliche phrases, but an abundance mindset that's grounded in love is
Yes.
is the differentiating factor, right? And but we tend to be, sometimes in the mindset of pragmatism, we go to this scarcity and fear-based mindset,
Mhm.
right? Which then leads to kind of all these things that you talk about, but it's
Right.
just as easy. And well, or maybe the effort is the same. The effort is the same to show up in a space of fear as it is to show up in a space of fear and scarcity as it is to show up with active abundance and a work for a common good. And um, you definitely take that thought through and encourage us and encourage Tete also, right? As you talk about the series of choices, you encourage her to think about. And so that leaves me with my last question. I mean, well, we'll go wherever you go, but um, I don't want to do spoiler alerts, but you do leave us with a compelling message of hope. I'll leave it at that. Um, and so I'll just, I would extend an invitation for, we tend to, on the podcast, ask our colleagues, in our last question, what advice would you give, the listeners and viewers, our audience, and specifically for our conversation in this particularly complicated time, what advice would you give us?
Sorry, I had to cough.
Mhm.
Um, what advice? Yeah, this is an incredibly, it feels like just endless years of this is a hard time. This is a difficult time.
Mhm.
Um, we've never seen terrible things like this before, but we have,
Mhm.
when you think deeply. And this was, excuse me, a Native American woman mentor of mine, where I was just like, I have no hope. Right, I've lost all hope now. And she said to me, "What would our ancestors have said in the face of genocide? Would we even be here? What would our ancestors have said in the face of colonization and apartheid? Would we even be here if they had said, oh, there's just no hope, forget it. Can't do anything. I'm just going to throw my hands up." Um, and I think about that because, and it's okay to feel like
Yeah.
ups and downs, of course. Um, but I think for me, it's been about being in community, like with folks like you, Mamta, and others, just to be like, hey, I'm feeling really low right now, and I need a moment. Um, you know, I I was feeling really low after the Supreme Court ruling because my whole career has been about supporting diversity policies and equity, DEI. Right now, it's called DEI, and
Mhm.
we're I'm sitting in a state right now that is
Mhm.
shuttering DEI offices and programs and budget. Um, and something that I have found hope in, and very real hope is, and I have this positionality to be in a blue state, right? I live in Illinois. Is I've been wringing my hands over half the country, right? That has been doing all this anti-DEI, anti-CRT, quote unquote stuff. But there is another half of the country that if we can compel those leaders to push ahead for a new creative solutions for a future that we deserve
Yeah.
and our children deserve. Um, but they shine away for a different possibility, right?
Mhm.
Um, and full disclosure, I've been working with the governor's office in Illinois, and I'm so inspired
Mhm.
um, that his leadership, his office has just been like, let's think of new ways. Sure, there was the Supreme Court ruling, and I feel, it's devastating, it's terrible. But as some of the leaders in our state capital have said to me, okay, even when affirmative action was okay, there were still equity gaps.
Yeah.
What can we do
Mhm.
now that even then we weren't doing?
Mhm.
And so there's an energy, I think. There's
Mhm.
possibility of energy and
Mhm.
creativity. And I think for folks who are working in higher ed institutions and student affairs divisions, I think about how when I was an academic advisor or when I was a student affairs professional, I had access to various networks
Yep.
and I understood how the system worked, right? And there were little things that I could do to kind of just subversively push ahead a little bit of an equity agenda.
Hmm.
And I got a lot of joy out of it.
Hmm.
As a faculty member, I was able to, the classroom was my space.
Hmm.
Um, and I was willing to really, I think we need to allow ourselves to be led by our convictions and values,
Hmm.
um, and not by fear,
Yeah.
right? Have a realistic analysis of your situation and realities and what you're willing to risk, but also know that you're not alone and that you don't have to do things alone. I think that's the most important thing is to do things collectively.
Hmm. Hmm. So powerful. There are no words that I can have to kind of close that out. So I'm gonna have us kind of end our conversation at that with your wisdom and hope, which I think so many of us, so many listeners and viewers need to hear. So I'm just so grateful, Leon, for you, to you, for the legacy of our relationship as well. You just, I mean, every interaction that you have with me has changed me. And so I think about the many interactions that you've had and now how this book will have a ripple effect of critical hope, in our communities. And I think we so desperately need that right now. So thank you. Um,
Thank you.
I love and cherish you, and I really want to thank you for your time and spirit today on Student Affairs Now. At this moment, I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Huron and Rutledge, Taylor and Francis. We deeply appreciate your support. Huron is a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice by creating sound strategies, optimizing operations, accelerating digital transformation, and empowering businesses and their people to own their future. By embracing diverse perspectives, encouraging new ideas, and challenging the status quo, Huron creates sustainable results for the organizations they serve. Rutledge Taylor and Francis is the world's leading academic publisher in education, publishing a wide range of books, journals, and other resources for practitioners, faculty, administrators, and researchers. They have welcomed Stylus Publishing to their publishing program and are thrilled to enrich their offerings in higher education teaching, student affairs, professional development, assessment, and more. Rutledge is proud to support Student Affairs Now. View their complete catalog of authoritative education titles at rutledge.com/education. I want to take a moment to give a huge shout out to our colleague and friend, Natalie Ambrosi, the producer for the podcast, who does all of the behind the scenes work to make us look good and sound good. Thank you so much, Nat. We really love you. And friends, if you're listening today and not already receiving our weekly newsletter, please visit our website at Student Affairs Now and scroll to the bottom of the homepage to add your email to our MailChimp list. While you're there, check out our archives. Finally, my friends, I'm Mamta Akapati. Much love and gratitude to everyone who's watching and listening. Please make it a beautiful week that honors your soul, spirit, and ancestral wisdom. Thank you, my friends.